I always get asked, why would I want to live longer if I'm going to have a poor quality of life? And the answers are they're not mutually exclusive. If you're improving your rate of aging, not only are you increasing your lifespan, but you're increasing your mental processing speed. You're increasing your facial appearance in terms of looking younger. You're improving your muscle mass and how you maneuver about the world. So all of these things can be improved if you just fix the underlying cause, which is the aging process itself. We can report out on the relative age and based on the performance and biomarkers of each of those organ systems. So the good news is we'll be able to tell you up to 10 different organ systems and how they're aging, and be able to find the one that is probably limiting your overall age the most. We have provided some data to UCLA for another marker called DNA methylation fit age. And this marker is actually able to predict a lot of fitness and performance metrics. So the three that are going to be the most prevalent are going to be your VO2 max, sort of your ability to strain your lungs, as well as grip strength, and then also gait speed.
All right, and welcome everybody to the show. Today, I've invited back a special guest, Ryan Smith. Ryan's been on the show a couple of times in the past, but I wanted to circle back because he's doing so many fascinating things with when it comes to age reversal medicine, when it comes to longevity. Not only is Ryan, a founder of TaylorMade Pharmacy, but who he's not involved with anymore, but he's also the founder of TruDiagnostics. And so today we're going to take a deep dive into what your TruAge test means. And then we're also going to show you some of the latest innovations in anti-aging medicine and in longevity. So let's give Ryan a big welcome. Ryan, welcome back to the show.
Yeah, thanks, Regan. Thanks for having me.
You got it. So you, in just a short amount of time, just a couple of years, TruAge has blown up to be the premier test when it comes to age reversal. And one of the things that you're looking at is this longevity leaderboard, and that's piqued people's interest. So tell me a little bit about that and how TruAge comes into that.
Yeah, so that certainly, has gotten a lot of publicity. I think that mainly we have one of our partners there to thank, which is a guy named Brian Johnson. And Brian is, pretty popular as an entrepreneur, but gained a lot of publicity for sort of talking about his $2 million age reversal protocol, where he does every year, which is, very, very expensive and certainly not needed for age reversal. But Brian, whenever we've been working with him for a while now, and he has reduced his epigenetic age by a lot. His rate of aging was 1.01, which means that 1.04, I believe, which means that for every year, he'd be aging 1.04 years biologically. And over the course of a year and a half, he was able to take that down to a rate of aging of, I think, 0.79, which is a very, very big reversal. Definitely a record, actually, within our cohort for longitudinal measures. And so, he sort of had this idea to make it a competition, to find out what all has been, changing for people and how to really drive down these metrics as low as possible. Brian's doing a little bit of everything, but he got, everyone from TMZ to The View talking about it, which is pretty great. Drove a lot of people to us and to this idea of age rejuvenation in the first place, especially beyond just sort of vanity or other concerns, and really drove it to a health-centered discussion. So, Rejuvenation Olympics has been definitely something we're trying to sort of popularize, encourage people to submit their data and really to find out what's working.
Man, I like that, Rejuvenation Olympics. And Brian Johnson, for those of you who don't know, he sold Venmo for $800 million a few years ago. He's from Provo, Utah, so he's a neighbor. And just an interesting, he's got an interesting take on longevity, but he looks so much younger. I mean, you just watch the videos of him, and he is literally reversing in age, and he's doing it. His whole philosophy is we need an N of one person to actually gather the data. He's got a team of 30 different doctors, but the importance of TruAge is it's the most accurate test that he can take to see if he's moving the needle. So tell us a little bit about TruAge. Maybe you could dive into some of the science and why it's more accurate than just a telomere test alone.
Yeah, certainly. I think that, in order to sort of give a background on it, I want to give a quick background on just biological age testing and why it's important. And the idea here is that, chronological age in and of itself is the biggest risk factor for every chronic disease and death. So if you can think of a disease, you can think of an outcome that you don't want to have. Age is the number one risk factor. There's a reason we see people in their 60s coming down with disease when people in their 30s are not nearly as likely to do that. And it's this age, and how you quantify that in your body is much, much different than chronologic age, right? We all know people in their 50s who look like they're 70 and vice versa. And that's really the process we want to measure is the age of someone's body and how they're progressing throughout life, and reducing what we call this loss of function as we get older. And that's really what we're trying to measure with biological age. And there have been a lot of methods to do this. Even early, very crude measurements, like, your chronological age plus 1 year for every pack per day you smoked, to now, more sophisticated methods, which, were things like telomere length, which track, the loss of DNA per cell. But now we've got probably the most accurate ways to do this through DNA methylation-based clocks. And the way that we know that they're the most accurate is that they're the most predictive of those outcomes. So for instance, if we look at what we call this idea of phenotypic variation, which is that difference in aging outcomes, right? So why someone might have more wrinkles than someone or might have a higher risk of cardiovascular disease, all of those things are incorporated into this idea of differentiation, phenotypic differentiation. And when we look at things like telomeres, they control right around 2.8% of that variation, compared to some of these epigenetic clocks, which can explain over 45% of that variation. So as we're trying to pick out which things are the most important to look at, we want to pick out the things which are most predictive of what's going to happen. And that's certainly these epigenetic clocks.
God. And that's the Horvath clocks. Are there other clocks now?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, the Horvath clocks are actually outdated now, and actually we wouldn't recommend using them. Those are clocks that have been trained to predict the chronological age of a patient. And the problem with that is that the better that those clocks get, the closer they get to just telling you your birth date, right? And so we call those first generation clocks. But now we have clocks that are much, much better, considered what we call even now third generation clocks, which are things like that rate of aging, which is why we've included it on that leaderboard. Just to give you an idea, one standard deviation increase in the Horvath clock would represent a 2% increased risk of mortality, versus one standard deviation of this gene pace marker would represent a 64% increased risk of mortality. So again, which one is more predictive? Definitively these newer clocks that are trained not on predicting chronological age, but predicting biological phenotypes. So what actually happens when we age. And it's also correlated to all these quality of life related metrics as well. I always get asked, why would I want to live longer if I'm going to have a poor quality of life? And the answers are, they're not mutually exclusive. If you're improving your rate of aging, not only are you increasing your lifespan, but you're increasing your mental processing speed. You're increasing your facial appearance in terms of looking younger. You're improving your muscle mass and how you maneuver about the world. So all of these things can be improved if you just fix the underlying cause, which is the aging process itself. I think one of the other really important things and really timely things while we're discussing about the other reason that these third generation clocks are so much better is they track intervention correctly. And that's really, at the end of the day, what we want to find out is how we can reverse our own biological aging process. And so on Monday, there was a study that happened with Columbia University where they looked at the effects of caloric restriction. And so this is essentially, eating less calories than you would burn per day. And they did this for 2 years in this calorie study at right around 11%. And what they found is that the group that did this caloric restriction, much like all the literature published before it, showed anti-aging reversals. But if you use those first generation clocks, unfortunately, they went up, which we know is not biologically correct. We know caloric restriction has been proven as the most validated intervention. And so those first generation clocks sometimes give you the wrong information, which is why we don't recommend using them at all. And the field has progressed a little bit beyond that. They're still highly predictive compared to things like telomere length. But now with the advents and increases and improvements we've had in these epigenetic clocks, these third generation things like that rate of aging clock are significantly better.
Got it. And so what are the other markers? I mean, the PACE test, that's a newer test that you guys have. It's a little bit of a simplified version, but what makes that one different?
Yeah, so that one is as I mentioned, a third generation clock that we developed with Duke University, and this is a really interesting clock because it actually we've tracked the same individuals over the course of their entire lives. So we started when they were born in 1972. This was a group of really young children, or I should say infants at the time, and we followed them almost every single year in this cohort. We actually just their 52-year age follow up this summer in New Zealand, which is our past winter. And we're going to continue following them until they die. And by tracking the same individuals over the course of their lifespan and getting a lot of that information, we can create some really predictive clocks that can tell us about all of these negative outcomes of aging. And so that TruPace is able to do that, but it's also able to do it at a low price point. And the reason we thought that was absolutely necessary is to, again, track what's working on an individual basis. You and I both might take metformin, but for you might have an increased aging rate and I might have a decreased aging rate. And so these clocks are definitely getting better. Around the horizon, we also have some clocks we developed with Yale, which can tell you the age of each of your organ systems. So musculoskeletal system, your heart, your brain, which might give more resolution into why we're seeing the aging process. And so we have some of those coming out. We also have a clock we developed for 2.5 years with Harvard. It'll definitively be the best clock out there. And that is going to be sort of our multi-omic trained clock that is informed on more biological information than ever been gathered on a certain subset of individuals.
Wow. So these clocks, and if we look at it, they are predictive factors. So I could, look at my patients and I can say, okay, well, here's where you are this year. And you're taking in other factors outside of the clock. Like, is it a subjective survey that patients are taking now? And then,
yes, sorry.
And is that feeding into the data as well?
So yes and no. So the data that we're using to report out your results are entirely based off the data we collect from your blood sample. There is no other information used, not your birth date, not any survey related data. It is all based on the data we're getting from reading your DNA. And we like to keep it that way because we don't want to influence the actual reading by any other metrics. In fact, including even your chronological age into these clocks can be something that actually throws off their performance, actually in a negative way. Because sometimes chronological age, as we already know, is not the most predictive of outcomes. And so we only use methylation information, which is reading that gene expression data within your DNA. So not whether or not you have a certain SNP or polymorphism, but whether or not that gene is turned on or turned off. And by reading that data, that's all we use. However, we do collect a lot of information in those surveys and intakes because we want to be able to find out what's driving those patterns. So we found out a lot of those correlations. For instance, we know that obviously stress and sleep and things are negative, but we also have information about what diet types are best to reverse your epigenetic aging. We've got some really exciting studies coming out on that with Stanford, looking at things like vegan versus carnivore diets. If anybody has been familiar with things like the Game Changer documentary on Netflix, and Netflix actually sponsored this study to look at the impact of diet outcomes for some of their programming. And so we're really excited to show some of that. But that information that we actually take on those other covariates, what medications you're taking, what diseases you might be predisposed to, it helps us train new and better algorithms to take away this diagnostic from just being something you're reporting on age, but to report it on multiple things within your body, everything from, what type of diet you're having to, what type of environmental pollution you've been exposed to. All of that can help us create new and better ways to read the data.
Man, I think that's phenomenal. And if somebody's, looking at the age of their organs, what's that test going to look like?
Yeah, so that test is the exact same. Just a simple blood spot fingers test, and it's actually even from the same data. And so the good thing is that if people test on our platform even 2.5 years ago when we first started, we'll be able to update their results with this new organ-specific information because we've already captured the data. We just now need to learn how to interpret that data. And so what we've done with Yale is created systems clocks that basically take information from each organ system. Things like, for instance, if you're looking at your kidney, your filtration rates, or your alkaline phosphatase, or some of those other kidney-specific biomarkers, and have scored them for an age of that kidney system. And then we've related that back to methylation, so we can report out on the relative age based on the performance and biomarkers of each of those organ systems. So the good news is we'll be able to tell you up to 10 different organ systems and how they're aging, and be able to find the one that is probably limiting your overall age the most.
Wow. And so there's different softwares out there where we can upload patient labs, just their blood serum, and it will shoot out a phenotypic age. What are your thoughts on accuracy of those tests? Just looking at the the CMP and some of those basic markers.
Yeah, probably the most, I would say, probably the most popular of all of those methods are actually things called like TruAge, which is actually created in tandem with the DNA methylation algorithm. So TruAge, developed by Morgan Levine at Yale, the same lab that actually is creating the system-space clock. Yep. So they created these 9 blood-based biomarkers. We got things like serum albumin. You had a couple others, and those are certainly not bad methods. They actually are definitely better than telomeres in terms of predicting algorithms, but they still pale in comparison to the DNA methylation-based predictors. And so actually, you can look at this at the exact same sample. DNA methylation TruAge is much more predictive of outcomes than just those 9 biomarkers it was actually trained on in the first place. And we see a lot of this. So for instance, we're actually coming out with a DNA methylation predictor of C-reactive protein here very soon. So we'll be adding that to our reports. But our DNA methylation predictor of C-reactive protein is actually much more highly correlated to outcomes of brain inflammation or brain-related neurodegeneration outcomes than regular C-reactive protein. So our predictors can find not just new ways of measuring something we've measured for a long time, but also ways to show associations to things in more positive and predictive ways. So our DNA methylation C-reactive protein might not be as related to cardiovascular, but it is certainly related higher to negative brain outcomes. And so by looking at those correlations, we can actually give a lot of information to an individual about what might happen to them, which is really the whole point of all this analysis.
Yeah. And I think that's the key thing is, okay, what do we do proactively to change it? I've had some patients who, they've had in the course of a year, their test results have gone, almost 10 years, almost a full decade of change. And we've had some patients who've come over and they've worked with other clinics, and we've seen just a massive increase in their biological age. And then I ask them, what's changed in your lifestyle? And, in one case, bankrupted business, divorce, in another case. So I see like stress being a big influencer over it. What are some of the other things that you guys are seeing that adversely impacts the age of somebody?
Yeah, I can't stress enough how much stress, no pun intended, makes a major impact on some of these markers. I always like to throw out a couple statistics when we talk about it, which is that even those people who work over 40 hours a week are on average 1.5 years older than those people who don't. Wow. As someone who works a lot, this is one thing that I didn't like to see, but it again helps inform change and lets you know how to mitigate it as well. We've even seen things like emotional regulation, your ability to control emotions, your amount of self-control be highly linked to these negative outcomes. And so I think those were definitely surprising to me. I mean, you've seen presidents, for instance, age drastically during their term as president, but this quantifies this in a way that, it's very tangible, even before it might manifest outwardly, right? Like with some of those presidents. So I can't, place enough importance on stress as a marker there. I think a lot of what we've also found epidemiologically is things that confirm our suspicions already, right? We know generally what types of diets are going to be best for us, right? We've seen the Mediterranean diets perform very, very well here. We've seen, that the amount of sleep that you get, or I should say the quality of sleep that you get, not the amount, be very highly predictive of your outcomes, your aging outcomes. We've seen, the amount of activity that you've had, greatly impact these aging markers. And so a lot of things we know intuitively, which is not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing because it confirms everything that we already know, and it confirms that our measurement is actually measuring the right thing. But there also have been some really surprising types of associations that we haven't seen. One is that we were seeing very low effect sizes for activity and exercise, and this really surprises us, as we know that exercise is one of the best things you can do to improve your longevity. What we found, though, was the reason for that is because it was definitely a biphasic response. Some exercise is great, but if you overdo it, you can certainly cause some negative aging outcomes, which actually, are going to be worse for you. And with us having a lot of Olympians, a lot of hardcore training athletes, a lot of professional athletes, we certainly see this. And so that was definitely a big surprise. I was also telling this story today about what we found in these large scale cohorts, and we found that bipolar patients always tended to be much younger, and that was very much a surprise. So the question was why. And when we pulled that thread a little bit further, we didn't find that bipolar patients were better agers. We found that the majority of the people who were bipolar were also taking lithium, and that lithium was also, very, very positive for the aging process. And now that's been confirmed in several other different studies as well, showing that lithium can positively impact the aging process. And so we're able to find a lot of these insights, which can really point us in the right direction on the best therapies and interventions.
Yeah. And it's just getting more and more accelerated, more data coming out. What are your thoughts on this Stanford project you're doing with the carnivore versus vegan? I mean, what are you seeing there? Or can you share?
Yeah, well, I can share some things, and I can't share everything, but I'm really, really excited about it because we had some of the best and most conclusive results we've ever generated. And this is extra surprising considering it was only an 8-week intervention. But the intervention was set up very interestingly. We actually took twins, so paired individual, identical twins, and we separated them. One was put on the omnivore diet. The other one was put on the vegan diet. They were controlled for nutrients, controlled for calories. So the only thing changing was one was omnivore and the other one was vegan. And over the course of 8 weeks and only looking at 40 patients, we found very significant results over those course of, and very consistent results over those course of those 8 weeks. And so it was definitely a surprise, especially the magnitude and resolution. Usually we wouldn't set up a study any less than 3 months because we wouldn't expect to see a signal. But in here, we didn't just see a signal, we saw a signal that was consistent across all of these different age clocks and had a very high sort of resolution and signal. So very excited to talk about that. We should be publishing results, I would say, in the next 8 weeks for sure. And I'm sure it will be, highly popularized, much like Brian's $2 million a year interventions.
Yeah. So are you saying a diet more like Brian's as being more favorable, or the other diet?
I can't say yet, unfortunately, but I will say that one of them is very clearly positive. And I was just sort of unblinded last week, which is why this is very topical in my mind. But we'll be able to have, I would say, some information to you in just a few weeks.
Okay. And then we'll get it out to you guys, because this podcast will be published sooner than that. But I'll make sure that I circle back around and give people the data, because I think it's pretty fascinating. There's so much politicking around diets, and everybody's got their own ideas. And so I'd be curious to see. And then are you doing another study with like straight carnivore, or what else are you doing with Stanford?
Yeah, so that's it for Stanford. But we are, I think, following it up with a couple other studies based on our results there. I think that we really want to dig into why we're seeing such a big difference, and especially across multiple methods of this type of measurement. And so the logical conclusion there is to start doing sort of going across that spectrum, right? And looking at things like entirely carnivore related diets. And I think that, we're certainly starting to see some patterns we wouldn't have expected there, even for things like muscle mass and frailty related markers. I think that I certainly, stay away from these vegan diets, mainly because I think that it might hurt my athletic performance or muscle mass related things. I think that I'm slowly starting to change my mind on some of those markers.
Wow. Okay. So even you're making some changes. How's your biological age doing these days?
Yeah, I think better than when we last talked. I think that when we last talked, I was accelerated biological aging, and I've certainly been able to reverse that. Not to Brian related standards, but certainly, had multi-year age reduction. So I'm now, I would say, in the top 25% of my age, which makes me feel a lot better, especially because our cohort's pretty hard to compete against.
Yeah. Because what are you, 31?
Yeah, 32 now. 32, and so biologically, in my late 20s.
That's awesome. Well done. Yeah. Good. And so, some of the other markers, I created a tool for one of my mentors, Dan Sullivan, called Fitness 50 at Age 100. And so as I was doing my own research, I was able to find some predictive markers for aging that people would want to do, like a single leg stand. Looking at balance can be an early predictor of a stroke or some kind of cerebral vascular event. Grip strength is a big one that's showing up. So we have people doing dead hangs, and we have ways of measuring that. But what are some of the things that people can do from a physical fitness perspective that you've found in your studies, or are you guys doing anything on like grip strength or muscle strength?
Yeah, so we are a couple of things, and I will go ahead and say, interestingly enough, the Dunedin pace highly correlates to all of those, probably more than any other clock. So grip strength and muscle mass in general, as well as one leg balance testing. We actually have their performance metrics at age 45, and the Dunedin pace is incredibly predictive of your performance there, which is certainly interesting. Also, we have provided some data to UCLA for another marker called DNA methylation fit age. And this marker is actually able to predict a lot of fitness and performance metrics. So the three that are going to be the most prevalent are going to be your VO2 max, sort of your ability to strain your lungs, as well as grip strength, and then also gait speed. And so the three of those will be actually in a report that we hope to have uploaded next week to those data sets to be able to predict sort of what your functional physical metrics are as well, because you're absolutely right. Those are how they manifest, in terms of some of those negative outcomes, and they're incredibly predictive, especially things like VO2 max. And so we've created some surrogate ways to predict them, because measuring VO2 max is actually quite difficult, right? You have to sort of be hooked up to a mask, exert yourself physically, which is, certainly not a bad thing. But it can be inconvenient and timely. And so we've created some surrogate markers, which are highly associated. That was happening with UCLA. We also are probably not doing a lot beyond that to predict those markers. But what we have done is a lot of studies on muscle itself and the best training practices to increase methylation patterns in that muscle. And so we actually published two studies actually with Auburn University, where we actually looked at how different types of training can affect different methylation patterns within the muscle itself. And so we were doing things like muscle biopsies, looking at, 3 reps till failure versus 1 rep till failure versus 10 reps till failure. And we saw some interesting things, which is that from a methylation perspective, as long as you're going to failure, it really has right around the same outcome. Here we're not looking at age as much, but we're looking at some of those patterns about how you might regulate things like hypertrophy or increased muscle mass. And we were surprised to see that it didn't matter how many reps, so long as you were going to failure.
Wow. Yeah. And I have read that as well. And then are you seeing anything as far as duration of exercise? I know there was a study that was published. They followed over 125,000 people for, 30 something years. And they found that people who did moderate exercise of 300 minutes a week, or people who did 600 minutes of kind of mild exercise or low intensity, they lived 27 to 30% longer. Do you have any reference on that, or what are you seeing in your testing?
Unfortunately, we don't. And that's been because we haven't played a huge emphasis on things like wearable data. But that's actually our next stage, is we're now working with integrations from Apple Fitness as well as Oura Rings to try and get some of that data. And look at how it's changing, at least longitudinally. And the great thing about that data is, much like our data, it's been collected in the past. So we can actually get this from participants who have already done our testing longitudinally to be able to do analysis and study. So unfortunately, don't have a lot to report there, but hopefully will in the future.
Okay. It's exciting. I mean, even your research with Auburn, because if everybody can have customized nutrition, customized, workout routines, that's the goal. Without spending $2 million a year like Brian Johnson, but thank him for doing that. I think it's fascinating watching it, because he's given me a lot of creative ideas, some of which I brought into the clinical setting. And then the other thing is, if you look at where this is going, do you guys ever see yourselves bringing in other types of testing? I know there's like Viome, where they're looking at the genetic markers and some of the RNA transcription factors in the gut. Or are you guys moving in that direction, or any other directions?
Yeah, certainly. We believe that a multi-omic analysis is very important. I always liken to mention, the Human Genome Project. I think everyone thought when the Human Genome Project launched, it would be the answer to all of our questions. But instead, it's one small piece of a very large puzzle. And we usually would consider that what we call this multiome, where you go from everything from the genome, just that underlying sequence, to above that, the epigenome, which is obviously what we focus on, which looks at that expression, then goes to things like the transcriptome, which would be the RNAs you mentioned. And then from there, go to peptides and proteins, which is the proteome, which creates the infrastructure of your body. And that infrastructure creates metabolites, which would be the metabolome. And then lastly, we'd have that be the phenome, or the phenotypic environment that we talked about earlier. What diseases are you diagnosed with? What color is your hair? All of those different outcomes. And so we believe that that whole picture is essential to understanding disease and human health in general. And it's only really now, for the first time, we have the tools and data analysis platforms to be able to analyze that data on such a large scale. And so we certainly believe that the more information, the better. But we also believe that methylation specifically is in a very unique place to be able to predict all of those other features. And so for us, we've, as I mentioned earlier, with Harvard, have worked on creating this multi-omic analysis where we're doing large-scale metabolites, large-scale proteomics, and then doing some full genome. We're doing some transcriptomics as well, ultimately correlating it to these outcomes. What actually happens eventually, and how can we predict it, or how can we tell even what the current status is? And so we're using a lot of that data, and we've spent a lot of time and money to develop that data. And so the answer is yes, we're expanding to a lot of those, but we still think methylation is probably the most cost-effective way to analyze all of those at once. And to do those through predictive algorithms where methylation can predict other outcomes like CRP, like grip strength and muscle mass. We think that we can go a large portion there, and then supplement it with other factors as necessary. So actually within the next week, we'll be adding NAD testing to our platform. We have never been, I would say, massive fans of metabolite testing, but NAD is just one feature of aging among many others, but it's one that can be really easily fixed as well. We have, NAD precursors that can be added. We can do, some people would do NAD infusions. And so with that being said, it's because it's so actionable, we'll be adding it to our platform here very, very shortly. In addition to that, we'll be adding SomaLogic's proteomic testing within our platform, which is much like methylation, and that data set can be used in a variety of ways to predict a variety of things, including, as we already have, VO2 max, or your body mass index, or some other things of that nature. And so the omics race, and with experts in every omic field, is certainly increasing. And how we interpret all of those for clinical output is really just at its forefront.
And has AI changed your process or capabilities?
Yes, absolutely. As I mentioned, we were never able to for the methylation data, we're looking at over 1 million locations in your blood, each with a number between 0 and 1. And that's a lot of data. That would, in order for a human to view that and even understand that, would be next to impossible. And so in order to look at these patterns, we have to use computer learning and artificial intelligence related methods to find patterns that we just can't find ourselves, and to control for things that we can't necessarily control for ourselves. And so that is sort of the backbone of this type of analysis in today's day and age. The bioinformatics that we use are certainly important to the outcomes and how well we're able to analyze that data. I always say that we're trying to create the Rosetta Stone of methylation, where we have this new language and we have no idea how to read it. And the only way we can find out how to read it is to use these tools to help us analyze it. And we're doing that. We're creating sort of ways to read that language of methylation.
Man, yeah, it's an exciting time that we live in. And are you seeing any change in people who optimize their hormones or using peptides? Are you seeing any predictable patterns that can be drawn out yet?
It's hard with interventions. And so we really, I would say, are seeing some patterns, but we don't like to talk about them just in case we're leading people down the wrong track. I think what we really like to see is controlled studies, ones that have taken a baseline, started an intervention, and looked at an outcome. Sometimes we don't have that data, but there are a couple things that I would say that universally across everyone seem to have a positive impact. It would be things like DHEA. It would be things like rapamycin. Rapamycin is probably one of the most sort of validated interventions for longevity across multiple animal species. We certainly see improvements in that rate of aging with Dunedin pace. In addition to that, I think that lithium, as I mentioned earlier, tends to have a very positive impact on these clocks. And then vitamin D. I think that those 4 things, along with stress reduction and getting your diet and lifestyle right, are things that everyone can do to have improvements in epigenetic clocks.
Yeah, yeah, those are pretty simple interventions, and I'm looking forward to the advancements where we can look at a peptide like a ptyalin, or we look at some of the thymulins and see if that doesn't help reduce the biological age. Because of course, anytime you're changing the involution of the thymus gland, you're creating less immunosenescent cells, and there's just I think you guys are just doing phenomenal things, on the right track to soon. I don't know if it's in the wheelhouse, but soon creating very personalized programs for every individual. Because Brian Johnson's got his longevity blueprint, and I'm like, I don't know that is what everybody needs. That's what he needs. Obviously, it's working, but pretty soon, do you guys see you being the leader in the predictive medical world when it comes to longevity?
Oh, absolutely. I think that for longevity, we already have easily the largest epigenetic database in the world, which is great. And that really is what leads to better and more invention in this area, the ability to read those patterns. And so we certainly believe that it's going to a personalized basis. And the more data that we collect and the more information we learn, the more we're able to report out on that. And so on that personalized basis to make specific recommendations. So we're getting very close to be able to predict, micronutrients, to tell what you're deficient in, to predict hormone levels, all with one, relatively easy test. And generally, they're not going to be as good as the gold standard methods. They're not going to be as good as your mass spec or your, immunoassays, but they get very, very close. And if you can consolidate all of that with one test, it can be very, very valuable.
Yeah. Well, this is exciting, Ryan. I know you are a busy human, and I appreciate your intelligence and you taking the time to speak with us today. Can't wait to hear what you're up to. Is there any other things or announcements that you'd like to share?
I think that for now, we'll keep it to that. I know that we've already probably overwhelmed a lot of people listening, but I think we'll always have updates and at a rapid pace, as you mentioned, it is going very, very quickly. And so I'll provide some of that information on the Stanford data when you have it, and we'll always stay in touch with other updates.
Okay, this is perfect. And I can't wait to talk to you again. And thanks so much for taking your time today. And for those of you who are ready to find out what your age is looking like from a chronological versus biological age, reach out to us. And we've got TruAge testing capabilities in our office. We can send it to you. They've been phenomenal for so many of our patients and for me personally. So thanks everyone for listening. Ryan, thanks again for being on the show. Really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks so much. Appreciate it, Reagan.